Something else that's been in the headlines lately is inflation, and we're hearing that inflation is here to stay. And obviously, I think most people can see some of that in their daily lives, where groceries just week to week seem to be costing more and more. Um,
Absolutely.
what is driving this inflation, and where do you think this is going to go? Over the course of the next year or so.
I think there's no question what's causing it, and it's the about $10 trillion of new money that was created in the last 2 years. Um, that's a lot of new money, right? And it's created in the form of a massive expansion of federal government bonds, right? So we have about 5 trillion there, right? And the other part of it is just a massive expenditure on the part of the Federal Reserve, right? So the Fed buys all kinds of different assets, right? And where does it get the money to do this, right? The money is created out of thin air, So how does this then translate? A lot of these are financial assets, right? So what the Fed buys is, they went on this huge buying spree in order to stabilize markets after, the great crash, the Great Recession, right? Um, and how does this then, if they're buying, stocks, bonds, derivatives like mortgage-backed securities, things like this, how does that then turn into an increase in the price of milk, right? Because I mean, aren't these like completely different and separate realms, right? Like finance and gas prices or whatever. Well, no, they're not completely separate, right? Because like when you accumulate money in financial markets, okay, you might leave it there for a while, but the purpose of money is ultimately to buy things, right? I mean, like at some point, you're going to take your fictional wealth that's on paper, right? And you're going to liquidate it and you're going to buy things with it. So it's inevitable that when you vastly, I mean, by trillions of dollars, right, expand the money supply, even if its immediate target is financial markets, and that's the first place that it flows into, which is absolutely the case, right? But eventually, it's going to flow out of financial markets because that's the point of money, right? I mean, the point of money is to purchase goods and services. Um, you might want to accumulate for a while. It might take a while to transfer, to rising prices. I mean, a $10 trillion expansion in the money supply, which is what this is maybe about a 50% increase in the money supply. So to say it's translated into about a 6% increase in prices just shows us that the correspondence is not exact. It's not immediate, right? Like it's not like, okay, you've vastly and dramatically increased the money supply and you immediately and automatically get the same amount of inflation. Not quite, right? It's a more complicated than that. But I think the end result is undeniable, which is, you cannot create trillions of new dollars of new money and have no effect on prices whatsoever. And anyone who says that that's possible, I mean, I just think like that's not true. I mean, there's not going to be an exact correspondence and it's not going to be instantaneous, but there's going to be some kind of effect, right? And I think that's what we're seeing. And I think it's very interesting that the media never gives that as an explanation. They say, well, it's, oh, the consumers are feeling better. Or they say, oh, well, a lot of volatility in energy prices, whatever. This is nonsense. I mean, like, okay, there's volatility in prices, yes, but that's not what we're talking about, right? We're not talking about volatility. We're talking about an overall increase that affects pretty much everything, right? And it affects things differently, yes. Some things are more volatile than others. We know this. The problem is that the level of prices has gone up, right? I mean, that's what the measurement indicates, right? It's not about volatility. It's about everything costs, 6% more on average than it used to, right? And are we all getting paid 6% more, right?
Right. I mean, and that was going to be my next question too, is do you think that this will inevitably result in higher wages? Just because, I mean, if groceries are costing more and more every time you're going to the supermarket, but your paycheck is the same, or you're going to get a 1% raise this year, again, that just seems like more pressure on the working class that's going to be potentially leading to strikes or just other kind of social unrest.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think the undeniable and immediate effect is it just makes people's lives worse, right? I mean, like it makes the life harder. if gas costs you $5 or $10 more to fill up your gas tank, that's money that you don't have for other things, right? And it's not very easy to get the way that our transportation infrastructure, heavily car reliant, right? It's not that easy to switch to something else, right? It's not that easy to say, oh, I'll just buy an electric vehicle or whatever, right? Like most people don't have that ability, right? Because, well, the electric vehicles are very expensive, right? Or new cars are expensive, and by the way, because of the supply chain issues, new cars are kind of hard to get these days, right? So, there's all these things that I think signal that just the immediate effect of the price increases is, yes, workers' lives get worse. Will that translate into higher wages later? Probably there will be some of that, right? Because the fact seems to be that there's a lot of what they call labor shortages, right? I mean, and the well-known antidote to that problem is to simply raise wages.
But they're
Businesses
not.
don't wanna
They're
do this.
seemingly not doing that, though, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's the last thing they want to do, right? They want to, I mean, this is why you see all over the place, right? They say, we need a manager, big signing bonus, right? They would rather give you a lump sum payment than have a higher wage, because a lump sum payment is a one-time thing. They understand that, right? That's on the books one time, right? Higher wages are an expense that's ongoing, right? So, businesses don't like that, right? And they're sort of taking advantage of people's desperation, like, oh, hey, I would like to have that signing bonus, right? I mean, I need money now, right? Of course. So I think there is going to be somewhat of a translation into higher wages, but is it going to keep pace? That's harder to say. I think that depends more on how strong labor is, right? Are people organized? Are people, is everyone on their own to navigate the capitalist labor market? Or, is there some kind of organized effort? Workers do better when there's an organized effort. That's what we see historically.
Just going back to inflation, obviously, I'm not asking you to make any predictions, but I'm just curious for your perspective on what you think the end result will be, from the Federal Reserve, from the government. Do you think this is going to result in higher interest rates in the short term? Do you think that there are going to be any kind of maybe like rollback of the austerity to kind of provide more social safety nets, just again because prices are rising? Like, what do you think their response to the inflation is going to be?
I think we have an interesting, yeah, it's hard to say, right? Is there going to be rising rates? There might be some rising rates. Rates are low and they've been low for a long time. So that's interesting, like when we look at the aftermath of the Great Recession and we see rates being, basically dropped to zero and then left there much longer than we'd ever seen before, even though the economy is supposedly recovering. I think it also kind of shows you that what the Fed does with interest rates really has very little relationship with the overall what's happening with inflation. It has very little relationship with even with bank lending, the thing that it's supposed to affect. For people who have taken like the basic Keynesian economics that's in like introductory macroeconomics, we're told, and this is followed up by every article in the business press. They tell, well, the Fed controls interest rates, and they do that as a way of controlling inflation. And you might look around and say, huh, how come we always have inflation then, right? I mean, like whether rates are high or low, there's always a baseline of inflation. And why is that, right? Why should prices grow 2% a year? I mean, 2% a year is considered low inflation, right?
Right.
Why should prices grow 2% a year? Like we're not really encouraged to ask that question broadly, right? I mean, the answer that I would give is, look, we have a banking system that's very decentralized. The Fed is not the only institution that creates money. Money gets created whenever credit is created, right? So how many places are there that create credit? I don't know, a zillion, right? I mean, like there's a lot of credit floating around in the economy, right? And does the Fed control that? Do interest rates control that? Not really, right? I mean, like at best, they have an influence on it. But that influence doesn't always flow in the direction that we think. And especially at weird times, right? Like COVID, for example, that's a pretty weird time, or the Great Recession, weird time. you lower rates to zero, but banks don't start lending again. What banks do is they accumulate $2.5 trillion in excess reserves. That's off the map in terms of, like if you take intro to macro, what you learn is, when the Fed lowers interest rates, the banks say, okay, well, we will lend more of our reserves and that will create more money. And, then, okay, right. So that's the opposite of that happened in the Great Recession, right? Banks were terrified. And so they didn't loans dried up, right? And this is a big reason why the recession was so deep and it hit so hard, right? There were all these businesses, about 80% of business investment is finance, right? So all these businesses could not invest because they relied on that financing. They thought that they had these lines of credit and so on, right? They thought that there was not going to be a problem because, it's an ordinary business for them, right? But all of a sudden there was a problem. All of a sudden loans are not available. And the same thing happened to millions of consumers, right? The credit line that you thought you had on your credit card, well, that went away, right? So this is banks destroying money, right? I mean, this is literally what it's called in economic theory, is money destruction. Even though rates were at historic lows, money destruction was occurring to the tune of trillions of dollars. So, the idea that the Fed, carefully calibrates, they step on the gas, they ease off the gas or whatever, as a way of controlling inflation rates, I think is just absolute nonsense. And I wonder whose interests are served by that narrative, actually, right? Because what we have is we have even during low inflation, we have the money supply continues to expand, right? So what is going to happen moving forward? That's a little bit harder to say. I think the Fed would love to raise rates, but they're always concerned. Well, how is that going to affect financial markets? How is that going to affect consumer credit? How is that going to affect all these other rates, which move together with it? And they might well. I mean, rates might continue to stay at historic lows. They might move up a little bit, right? I mean, they've moved up a little bit from their, if we look at mortgage rates, for example, they've moved up a little bit. Mortgage rates are still incredibly low. So, what does that mean for the average person? When rates are low, it's like credit is a little bit cheaper, right? You can refinance and whatever. And this is what's been keeping, I think, a lot of, American households afloat, which is, we have access to debt at an extent that we haven't had, before about 1980 or so, right? So for the last, it's about 40-year period, right? Credit has become much more available to the average household. And we've used that to, deal with the fact that wages are also much lower, like once they're adjusted for inflation, right? They're much lower. So I think that system kind of works for the financial sector. And I think they wouldn't mind seeing that kind of return. But I mean, it's very hard to say. I guess we'll see, right?
Well, and I guess that was another question that I had also. When you have rates so low and you have inflation so high, I mean, that can turn into effectively like a negative interest rate, right? Like I've seen people saying, like, now's the time to take out a mortgage because you're effectively getting paid to have a mortgage. If inflation's 7% and the interest rate is 3%, so you have a negative interest rate. So I mean, is that kind of a silver lining? I mean, obviously, there's, if your wage is worth less and less every week or every month, obviously that's a bad thing. But should people, I mean, is this the time for people to be taking out more loans because they're effectively, getting paid to do so?
I would ask the question, is it money that you can use, right? Because so the average person has one home, if they own a home, right? They have one home, and so if that home goes up in value, how does that help you, right? I mean, like, you could borrow against it, right? You can withdraw the home equity. And lots of people have done that, right? That's kept afloat millions of households, right? But the problem with withdrawing equity is, you might end up paying more there, right? Or you might just never pay off the house, right? Because if you keep on, or if the house goes up in value, you take out the equity, right? You're on track to like never pay it back, right? Well, that's a certain kind of precariousness, isn't it? Because, if you pay off your house, if you lose your job, then you're not going to lose your house, right? I mean, like there's a certain security in that. Um, I mean, we know that looking back, like 1960s, 1950s, people had a very different attitude about like refinancing, about second mortgages or third mortgages, right? Which is basically you would never do that unless it was an absolute life or death thing, right? And people would throw parties when they paid off their mortgage, right?
Right.
Because you're finally out from under the bank. You're not, I mean, the amount of interest, the amount of accumulated interest that you pay on a mortgage is absolutely huge, right?
Right.
And I think we're not really encouraged to do the math. So the only really way that you can profit, bottom line answer to this question, the only really way that you can profit from negative real interest rates is if you're a real estate speculator, or if you're a real estate developer, and that's who really benefits from it. If it's your own personal house, it's hard to see like a real lasting benefit unless you trade down. I mean, this is something that like my parents did, right? My parents had a big expensive house. They lived in Marin County in California, and then real estate boom proceeded, and they downsized and bought a much cheaper house. And then they took the proceeds from that and invested in whatever, right? So maybe there's a way that you can sort of tinker around the edges, but in general, if you're staying in your house, it's very hard to see how you're going to get a real lasting benefit. Probably what's going to happen is that your level of risk and your level of leverage creep up. You know what I mean by that, right? Like,
Sure. Let's move away from mortgages per se. Like, what if you took out a credit card with 0% interest?
Yeah.
And you bought a bunch of electronics, and then 6 months or whatever, something that you could sell for theoretically the same amount or more in the future. Like, wouldn't that be a way to kind of navigate the inflation?
It's possible. Yes, you could use loans to essentially buy low and sell high through a variety of means. Maybe by reselling consumer products, maybe through financial markets, right? But it's risky, right? I mean, all these things are. So, and this is what leverage is, right? Leverage is using debt to magnify returns, right? So, does it create possibilities? Yes, it can, but it's also very risky, right? So I wouldn't say that in general it offers a very good answer for the average person. I would say maybe, like if you're sophisticated, if you know something about this, if you know something about arbitrage, basically, maybe, and you're willing to take a risk, right? Then maybe you can do that. But is that going to help the average person? I think the average person is very clear what becomes of them with a 0% introductory rate, which is that they, just get in debt, and then the rate ends. And, they needed that money to fix their car or to, right, for basically a necessary expense, something that should be covered in a just society, should be covered, but isn't, I think that's where that kind of average person is. But hey, more power to you. If you can figure out a way to borrow at a negative rate and make something out of it. Mostly what we see is that the big investment houses, right? The big real estate developers that tend to benefit from low rates, as far as in my observation.